Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of Real Talk. We are back with another roundup episode. I believe this is number 7, and this is episode 80, which is crazy. They keep flying by. On today's show, we have the regulars, so that'd be myself, Lucas Holfluer, Tyler Vanderbilt, of course, and as always, joining us on roundups most often is our good friend Jon Dykstra, here to share his wisdom and wit, I'm sure. So today, we're going to cover the last 3 episodes. Which is kind of a bit more of a random assortment if you include the one that I just did with the fellows from OFAD. But we started off, we had episode 77 with Mark Den Hollander. Ty hosted this one, and this was all about our Dutch Reformed history, which is I found quite interesting, and I'm kind of excited to get into that with you guys. Then we had episode 78, Church Discipline Matters. Fancy little title there, I like that. With, of course, Reverend William Den Hollander. And that was Ty hosting that one as well, talking all about church discipline, which again was a nice, I thought clarifying episode, and just good to have Reverend Den Hollander on to hear from his many years of experience. And then, like I mentioned, episode 79 with the guys from Once for All Delivered, also known as OFAD. They're a couple pastors down in the States. And I talked to them all about their podcast and what their interests are and what they cover, including Satanism, AI, and sphere sovereignty, as the title suggests. So that was a fun little conversation, and we'll get into those guys and introduce them a little more at the end of the show. And then finally, Jon's going to hit us with a couple movies that he's liked so far in 2023 and give us a few thoughts on that. And you can check them out as well. So without further ado, that's been a lot of talking about me to start out the show. I will throw it over to Tyler, I think, and we'll start with episode 77, The Dutch Reformed. You hosted this one, Ty, obviously. And what were your thoughts going into it? What were you trying to accomplish, and were you happy with the episode, and what did you learn?
Terrible episode. No, I really like, I think this was one that we really wanted to talk about when we first started the podcast. I can't believe it's been like, it was 70 something episodes before we got to it. I think the goal was to understand, like, we, as kids, I think in elementary and in high school and stuff, we spent a lot of time with like the Reformation, Luther, although we probably don't remember enough, like Luther and Calvin and like John Huss, I remember, and like some of these Zwingli and some of these characters from the Reformation period. And then kind of moving into the Netherlands a little bit. So that's kind of where we started the podcast. And then I don't really remember learning a lot about our Dutch history, which is like, I mean, some people are proud of it. Some people are, ready to set it aside. And I think this episode kind of gave us reason to cherish it, or at least to know what's going on, what happened, and why Holland was important. Something I never really like knew before. And I mean, if I'm not like reading Dutch literature, or like reading Inheritance Preserved is probably the best book on it. I just don't think we know enough or learn enough or care enough about it. Just the history from the Netherlands, basically from the Canons of Dort kind of time in the 1500s through to today, where we are, and then why we're who we are, and why all the other denominations around us are who they are. So it was interesting to learn about that, and learn about where some of the other Reformed denominations, like say Michigan, where that group of Dutch Reformed people came from too. It's kind of cool to see where everyone's kind of split off, and it really like led to frame a lot of the things we've talked about, even in the CanRC URC relations episode. Some of the issues that we talk about, this kind of framed it a little bit for like, well, where did that all come from, and why did we have all these arguments, and then why do we feel feelings nowadays about issues that were from our past. Like, I think one of the funny ones is just the Psalms. We've talked about Psalms a lot, and Mark touched on that in that episode about like why we're so, in the Dutch Reformed world, we're so protective of psalm singing, and there's good reason for that. It's just that you just don't know that until you go back, and you kind of default to the older people in the congregation, I think, to remember that history. But it's good as young people too to, and John, to go back and learn all that.
Wow, Jon just catching the shrapnel there. Okay, well, yeah, go ahead, John. Your chance to
Yeah,
respond there.
just I grew up basically hating church history, and it took me a long time to be able to open up anything about it. But just C.S. Lewis said, I think for every two books you read about today, you should read at least one old one, just to understand those kind of fights, where they're coming from. I grew up with a whole bunch of Christian Reformed relatives, hung out in Christian Reformed circles, and I didn't know why they looked at me a certain way. They had this idea that we were all these fuddy duddies. We are the unloving sorts. And then I dig back into our church history and I find out that they're aligned with the church that kicked us out. They were the, it blew my mind to find that out. So I appreciated the overview too, just to get the pieces kind of slotting in. I know a lot of this in bits and pieces because having neglected my school studies, I've had to learn this since then by myself. But yeah, it's quite a history. I think we often slide into this idea of things are getting worse and worse, but it came up there that they had soldiers in people's houses at one point, and
Yeah,
you
crazy.
realize, yeah, you know what? There's a lot of up and downs. Maybe we're even are in a bit of a down now, but they've seen things. The church has struggled with greater matters than these, so it's an interesting sort of encouragement to realize um, God's people have made it through worse. God has been faithful through greater difficulties. So yeah, appreciate it a lot. Um, I'll make a pitch for the RP website. If you look through church history, just search for church history. Chris DeBoer's written a few interesting things. We've got a lot of biographies that are really helpful. If you ever want to learn, the reason I hated church history was we had the worst textbook. I don't even know who's by, but it was enough to drive off a friend of mine who's now a pastor, has like a PhD doctorate. He also hated church history. He had to come back to that. Now he's a church history buff. But biographies are a really fun way to learn about how God's just dealt with people in the past. So lots to plug there, lots to look through there.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Yeah, the other thing that stood out to me was I think you see a lot of, well, it was helpful, first of all, just to see, to frame the discussion, like you guys mentioned, and to see where other Reformed denominations have popped up over the years. And okay, there's immigration is at play there, and then various splits in the old world versus the new world sort of thing. But it made me think, like, going forward in the future, if how connected we all are now, that probably I would say the geographical like splits and little areas where there was like, okay, we had a little mini reformation here or a split here, and this church popped up, and then you have another like very much aligned church in this area. If we'll see more like a larger body form over the years, because like we talked about in the Counter-Heresy episode too, like there's a good appetite for people to get together and to kind of, I don't know if amalgamate's the right word, but to come together and to remove barriers, any barriers that are there that we can remove, while still remaining faithful to the various doctrines we do hold. So that was just an interesting thought I kind of had going forward in the future, to see if more churches will kind of coalesce and come together as we are more connected. Because it, like, in some ways, John, like you mentioned, maybe it seems like, we're in a downtime in terms of the broader culture and where we're at least in the West. But you could make a reasonable argument that as far as like Reformed Church polity, we're actually in a bit of a moment of strength in terms of the unity we have across the various churches in NAPERC and whatever. We know where everyone kind of stands. We do know the differences, at least I would say those in leadership. Maybe the lay people, like you guys mentioned, Ty, in that episode, we don't read as much about doctrine and church history and whatnot, so we could do better to educate ourselves. But I think we are somewhat, at least in a moment of strength in terms of knowing who our Reformed brothers and sisters are across the continent.
Yeah, that was definitely a takeaway, actually. Now that I'm thinking about it, Yeah, he mentioned that there were people like our grandparents and stuff who would come home from like whatever. I don't know what kind of blue collar work you do, but on Saturdays, Sundays, they'd be sitting down. I mean, they didn't have TV, so like there's no distractions. But they would be sitting down and reading like Calvin's Institutes, and they'd be reading like this heavy, dense stuff that, like, I mean, whatever we talk about a lot of church issues. We have a podcast, and I still don't do that stuff. And like it's still hard for me to read Clarion and or Reformed Perspective like through all the way cover to cover. Luckily, Reformed Perspective hits my email, then it hits my coffee table, so I get mostly through that. But it's like, are we really seeking out that information? And then, I think we should probably, that's a good caution for us as young people, like really we should be digging into this stuff, because we've seen with COVID stuff like this, like things happen in the world that we need to be ready to respond to. And if we stop reading and we stop caring and we have this it's okay, we're just all Christians attitude, we're not going to be able to keep this alive. So, but I also like, I mean, maybe the other side of the coin from what you were saying, Lucas, like I think there's some people who get demoralized about where we are as a church or as federations. Like, if you're not seeing that unifying like spirit in all your interactions, like people see, oh well, we're just in a time of deformation and don't worry, it'll all come back around, like, because it does in history. Like, that's just having a defeatist attitude about it. I don't think is helpful either. And just listening to this, like listening through the episode, will be like, well, here's why you don't have to be defeatist. Like, I think there's really good action steps that we can, as long as we keep talking about things and writing stuff and reading, and like, this doesn't have to be the trajectory of, where we're going to go.
Yeah. You need to have a love for history so that you can have an understanding of where these differences came from. Like, we're talking about being more united now. Okay, well, if it's not going to be just sort of a paper over unity where we're united because we just don't know we just don't know anything, we're going to have to understand where people came from, why the differences started, just historic things. Like, why do we have a certain sort of sermon in our churches and they're a little bit different there? Is it because they're liberal, or is it because in the Canadian Reformed circles we reacted against really superficial preaching that had nothing to do with Christ and was all about application, to sermons that were all about Christ and didn't have very much application? And then if we go and see somebody over there that never had that battle, and they're talking about Christ and they're talking about application, that doesn't mean they're liberal. That just means they didn't have that fight over there, right? So just to know these things in their past, in our past, battles over creation are going on in all sorts of denominations. Well, are these guys, have they won their battle? Are they in the middle of their battle? What was their historic roots? Just things like that. So we really do have to dig past if we're going to be truly united.
And it is, like, to your point, Ty, I think it actually is fair to say it's harder to set aside time to read, like to dedicate time to read today than it was 50, 60 years ago, which isn't an excuse because we have so much information at our fingertips. So it's not like you couldn't read about it online, or, you can listen to like anything under the sun these days, audiobooks, podcasts, whatever. So we can certainly be informed, but yeah, you have to definitely make an effort to, as you're saying, John, because it is so important. Okay, cool. Maybe we'll put a bow on that discussion because I could go on all day. But John's got a point. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just going to add one more thing. I'll grant the more distractions, but I will say that the dry as dust textbook that I had has now been replaced by all sorts of books, all sorts of podcasts, all sorts of other ways that you can broach this that are accessible, that are intriguing, that have been written to grab you. So we kind of live in a golden age. The the grandparent farmer that we might have had who was going through Calvin's Institutes, dude, that guy was amazing. We have no excuse. Just put down the phone, go grab something, go listen to something.
Yeah, that's true. I've like me and a couple of my brothers, my dad have been reading through the Institutes. Most of them have been actually reading it. I have a physical copy, but I've been listening to it on Audible. So It was something ridiculous, like 66 hours, but I got like 10 to go. And a lot of time I just do yard work and I'll listen to it. As long as it's not anything too crazy, I can actually like follow along. And it's yeah, it's very interesting to read through it because it's like completely systematic, right? So you get a good feel for the time. And I mean, a good chunk of it's just dunking on Catholics, which is amusing to listen to. But yeah.
And if
That's cute.
Calvin's too much, then R.C. Sproul's got his own, and it's 1/10 the size, and has him reading it. So
Yeah, there's tons of stuff out there for sure. Okay, episode 78. So church discipline, Den Hollander. So this is also a one that we've been, I mean, this has kind of been Ty's like baby for like the longest time trying to talk about this topic. And I can't believe it took all the way to 78, but he finally got a good episode directed on church discipline. So I personally found it quite refreshing to listen to this and to hear it just straight goods on here's why we have church discipline. This is how we think about the church family, elders, their place and whatnot. And then also to do so in that spirit of love, right? Like you sign up for this, like in the sense like you are part of the church, you have a standard. Elders are there to hold you to that standard. And it's in this whole spirit of brotherly love, not this top down, like this is our cult, this is our rules, like we just love to be authoritarian. So yeah, I found it refreshing, like I say, and encouraging. And yeah, it's a good system. You could see why it's one of the keys of the kingdom. He talked about that as well. But yeah, I'll flip it over to you, John, and then we'll give you the floor, Ty, to run with it after John.
yeah, Ty, you were talking about having sort of a little bit of, maybe I'm characterizing it this way, just difficulties with this doctrine because it seemed unloving or just harsh. And so I appreciated when Reverend Den Hollander talked about, have you ever been punished by your parents? But what struck me there too was, as a parent, now I'm looking at it a different way and saying, have you ever punished your children? Like there's occasions where as parents you're punishing out of justice rather than maybe discipline, and that's not how it should be done. But there are times where you're just like, oh, child, you need to be spanked for your good and your good only. I don't even want to do it, but I have to do it because I love you. We're not going down this path anymore. We're drawing a line, pure love, as I smack your behind. And so to look at it from a parent's perspective, see what the Lord's doing with discipline, it is a different look. Years ago, I had somebody in a pro-life group I was a part of just kind of tearfully tell the group about how she had driven her friend to the abortion clinic. She was 100% pro-life, but she couldn't let her friend go alone. And that was the thing. It was like, at some point you have to tell her in love, I'm not going to go with you to that place. I'm not going to take you to destruction. So it's a loving thing to say no. And she didn't understand that at the time. So it is something that troubled me, this idea of discipline, this idea of a church just coming down on someone. But as a parent, I feel like I appreciate it a lot more. I've seen it work. So God knows best. But I really appreciated you going through that with Reverend Den Hollander.
Yeah. I know. I really, yeah, like Lucas said, like I've kind of always wanted to talk about this. We've touched on it a few times through other episodes and stuff where it's kind of come up, but just really to just talk about it face on, like what the church, what is the role of discipline in the church, and then the church leadership too. Yeah, to your point, John, like the comparison to the like parental discipline was huge in my mind too. I think it's partly a cultural thing, and it's partly like it's just also a kind of a loving inclination, I think, to not punish your kids. Like you punish, like punishment is discipline, but discipline, like punishment can go further than like a loving discipline. So like kind of parting the two a little bit, but like understanding, like our confessions talk about discipline as punishment, but also to understand that discipline was like is coming from that loving place where as parents we would all like recognize like this is biblical discipline, even if you don't, you know, meet that standard all the time. I think that's kind of where the church leadership needs to be too, and also as lay people in the church to understand church leadership in that light, which is hard if they don't understand it in that light, or if you don't always see it like that. Like if you're a kid being disciplined by your parent, you don't necessarily see that love, and maybe rightfully so because it's not in love sometimes. But it's like if we all understand that that's the ideal, then we can better understand like the Bible's model for and God's model for discipline. So that's kind of like what I always wanted to kind of hammer with this and like really understand. And I think like, yeah, Reverend Van Hollander did a great job kind of laying that out. And whenever I asked, like, you notice whenever I ask a question, just a little bit like, yeah, but what about like this? He's like, no, that's the wrong question. Like that is something that was like kind of important to me in this topic is like, I often with topics like this, you ask questions wrong because you're like, well, what about if I did this? Or what if the leader did that? And it's like, that's not the point. Like here's the point. Stop asking dumb questions. So it's, yeah, that was really good. And then the one thing that hit me was he talked about the patience God had for Israel in the desert, and also looking at like what the timeline of that was. Like for hundreds of years, or like tens of years, hundreds of years, God was patient with his people. And in my mind, I'm always like, okay, well, like you fell into sin, you're an unrepentant, excommunicate them. Like it's like, but using the model of God's patience with Israel in the church as leaders, like elders being patient with the people in church, like things take time to really heal, and for somebody to like, you may need to experience things in your life that help bring you back on top of, you know, exhortation from an elder. So like just understanding that and being like patient and loving while not also just being tolerant. That kind of really helped me like, okay, this is kind of, yeah, the model that we should be following. Like, and yeah, so interesting thing about that too. I interviewed him on a Thursday, I think, and I flew back to Ontario on Friday, and he officiated a wedding for my cousin. I was in that wedding party on the Saturday, so I actually saw him the day after I recorded this with him. So that was pretty funny. I was welcoming him to the whatever, the rehearsal or whatever it was the day after. So we thought that was pretty funny. So could have done it in person.
Small world. Crazy.
Yeah.
All right. Any other thoughts, John, or go ahead?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to bring it back to the parental aspect, because you also brought up the idea of withdrawal, and the parent analogy is applicable there too. I think in the past, my scope of things isn't too broad, but there's a saying: if you want to spank your kid, don't, and if you don't, maybe you got to get off your butt off the couch and go do what you need to do. But if you want to discipline someone, there might be a real case where it's like, okay, wait a sec, you know, patience, all of that, right? Are you approaching this in love, or is it just this guy's trouble and you've lost your patience? But in the past, there has been in some instances where people just frittered away. They just, you know, 5 years later, when they don't know anybody left in the church, they get excommunicated, and it doesn't really mean anything to them anymore. As far as I know, we're in a very different place these days, but that is something to watch out for. The one question I would have for Reverend Van Hollander was with withdrawals, because he said, how do you discipline someone who's not under your authority anymore? And my question for him would be, how do you take yourself out? How do you take yourself out from under authority? If my child can say, I've decided I'm not going to listen to you now, were they ever under my authority in the first place? If they can decide when and when not, they will be under my authority. I think that's something, I stand to be corrected, but I think that's something where if you place yourself under authority, you're under authority. How do you withdraw that?
This is this is a question that I've been asking for forever. We actually asked Dr. Witten this too at some point, but it was yeah, that was about the church order we were talking. And withdrawal, I think the one helpful thing that Reverend Hollander said to that was there, yeah, kind of like you're under the leadership of the church, but at some point the leaders, like, you kind of get out of their jurisdiction a little bit, but also, like, is there oh shucks, how did he say that? Not really is there a point, but he said it's not wrong to necessarily excommunicate that person, but is it really beneficial to, like, are you doing anything when you excommunicate somebody who is just removing themselves from the church? And in a way, it's, you want to say it's like more humiliating them. It's not really, but it's like exercising the keys of the kingdom. It was what it always was in my mind. Like, don't the keys of the kingdom still need to be exercised on this? Like, if you're a parent too, like, the child removes themselves from your, like, jurisdiction, like, that's not really a thing. But at some point, a child can leave, and then what are you going to do? Like, so it's still kind of conflicting in my mind. The one thing that he kind of, like, when he led the discussion a little bit, was excommunicating the person is not really the point. Like, the exercising the keys of the kingdom is not really the point, which I always thought it as a thing, like, we exercise the keys, but discipline in itself is the keys of the kingdom. Just like preaching is a key of the kingdom, it's not like the key of the kingdom is you being preached at. It's like the ongoing preaching is the key. And so that the ongoing discipline in the church is the key being exercised. So we see it, we feel it as lay people in the church, even when it's not us. We feel it if it is us, and then it's not really the final act of excommunication that is the discipline. Like, the discipline's the whole process and the whole oversight and mutual discipline. It's not necessarily like the excommunication where the discipline is, like, the key is actually, like, yeah, used, right? So that kind of helped me a little bit. Like, so if you're withdrawing, you're not necessarily withdrawing and then a key of the kingdom needs to be exercised on you. It's like you're withdrawing, but then you've experienced that key along the way, and this is kind of just where it ended. Like, yeah, I don't know, it's very hard to understand.
You basically bring the key to bear upon yourself if you withdraw,
Correct,
right?
yeah.
And then but like, it's still, yeah, I agree with bold opinion. I agree with Reverend Hollander on this one. Like, it's they can do it if they would like to, but it actually, the only reason you would probably do it is just to send a message to the congregation saying, like, this is the final step of the process. We believe this process is important. Just so you know, like, this is what the person has done to themselves with withdrawing, right? Because if they ever do come back around, and these stories do happen, they are still subject to the process to get back into the church, which is obviously putting themselves back under that authority. So yeah, I don't know. It makes sense to me. I mean, where it gets murky is, like, the whole, like, in the CanRef church, where it's like, we don't have how does that go again? If you want to go to a free reform church, you would basically have to withdraw to go to a free reform church. But if you go via the URC to the FRC, then it's all, it's all roses and there's no problem. So there's, like, some weird institutional loopholes that way, which I guess that's where it comes down to, like, a grace and a case by case situation. But yeah, overall, I'd like this explanation.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a idea of the final proclamation being some maybe magical element to it. So long as you hold that off, I mean, people will withdraw hold that off. And then this idea of it all being a process, yes, very much. And so then again, it's not like we have to get those final words out. The whole process has been part of it. But I have heard people read it as you were saying it, Lucas, just that they've effectively excommunicated themselves, and there is a certain clarity that comes with it being stated that way.
Yeah, the one thing that I found was the like we have forms for excommunication, but we don't have a form for withdrawal. Which, yeah, I mean, obviously you wouldn't have a form for that. But if the announcements that get made, I think we have to be very careful with what we say. And I think Reverend Hollander alluded to that too. He really emphasized the grace in it. And my tendency is probably not to emphasize the grace in it, but the way that a withdrawal is announced, I've seen it done very well, and I think I've seen it done reasonably poorly in our churches. And I think it's like something that we really need to think about how we announce. Like, do we view it as that excommunication, especially when everyone or many people in the congregation know the situation, or we've prayed for the situation, especially if it's been going down the excommunication route, and then say right before you excommunicate someone, they withdraw. Like, that announcement seems, in my mind, should be much different than if somebody, withdraws as a technicality because they're going to go to the FRC, where we're like, 2 legal loopholes away from just sending your attestation. So yeah, it's I think, it's just a caution for people. I mean, I don't really have a solution, but I've seen it done really well. So
yeah.
If we have an understanding, like if generally people have an understanding of what the process is and what it's for and how the key is actually operated, then I think the people giving the announcements, elders obviously, would be able to do that well. And I think they do to a certain extent. But yeah, like you say, Ty, I'm sure it happens where it's not as clear as to what the purpose of the process is and how withdrawals is delineated from excommunication. Okay, I think we're good there. Probably beat that
the
horse
deep
to
one.
death. Yeah. Okay, this last one's a little easier. It's pretty it's more surfacey, just more fun. The guys from OFAD. One's for All Delivered. 2 pastors, like I mentioned, one from South Dakota, and the other guy was from Idaho, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So 2 interesting guys. They both were in seminary together at the same time. One was OPC and the other was URC. The one guy, he was like down in like a real small town in South Dakota too. And he grew up in Wyoming, which he had a funny Wyoming accent. So it was fun to talk to him, to hear that as well. But yeah, I thought they're interesting guys. They got their start kind of covering Bavinck, which some of our listeners may know, some may not. It's kind of some heavier theology topics with his writing. But I'm sure some people are familiar with him. And they've kind of branched out now to cover more and more topics, which we got into during the podcast as well, including Satanism, which they seem to see everywhere they go. Which, I mean, honestly, there's some validity to it. Like, John, you got a kick out of that. You wanna comment on these guys and what you thought?
Yeah, I basically, the episode got me curious. So I've already done a little bit of digging through their climate change episodes, and I'm going to enjoy. I think I'll really enjoy both of those. And I'm grateful that you introduced us to them, because they had a number of episodes where I would just kind of congratulate them for their courage. COVID, we've all had a shot at tackling it, but it's always tough to deal with. They had to go with that as well. It was interesting to hear just sphere sovereignty explained. Was that Caleb who gave it?
Yeah,
a
I
bit
think
of
so.
overview? It was very well done, very illuminating. So I'd never heard of these guys before, and I look forward to checking them out.
You see, you're gonna have to feature them on your ongoing column in Clarion. So
It's true. Yeah.
If no one's checked that out, that's a pitch for Clarion. I don't know if we're allowed to do that on Reformed Perspective, but go check out Lucas's ongoing list of podcasts to check out. So yeah, I thought it was, yeah, like what you said, it was just it's like interesting to hear these guys and then like a general overview of what they talked about. But like, yeah, I think they're very bold, they're very they're biblical, and they're okay standing up against like and saying things that like I'm listening to it. I listen to it on YouTube and I'm like, yeah, this is gonna get taken down. Just like if we actually had a platform where it was like, millions of people, this would be gone so fast. So it's really good to hear that. If you might one day have to have a hard time finding them back, but it's yeah, I mean, it's probably inspiring for us to maybe do a little bit more of that. They did talk about the way that they want to tackle topics, which is interesting. As a podcast host, you're like, oh, I wonder how these guys think about it, and really focusing in on like the application of our Christian life in the culture. So, and we've talked about that a lot as in the background for our listeners. Like we talk about how to what we want to tackle, and I mean I like the church issues and things like that, and they said they kind of stay away from that because they don't like to get too pigeonholed into stuff like that, or they get really deep into theology, but they like to tackle like the cultural issues and then like apply Christian principles to that. So I think it's yeah, I think that's gonna be a cool podcast to go check out. So really appreciate them.
Definitely. Well, that actually ties in super well with an upcoming podcast we have. I just finished reading this book, Interpreting Your World, 5 Senses for Engaging Theology and Culture by Justin Bailey from Dordt College there. Looks like this for anybody who's interested. Good book, all about exactly that, like the application of our theology in culture. And also kind of like vice versa too, the culture and theology, and how just the actual lived experience of like, this is what we say we believe. What do we actually do every day? How do these two merge? And then how do we think about that? And he kind of has, like the title suggests, five lenses for viewing that. So I found it to be a pretty interesting book. I hadn't done a ton of reading into this area before, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So stay tuned. That should come out, I don't know, probably in about a month's time or so for our listeners. Okay,
Did you
go ahead, sir.
When you were talking to those guys, do you feel like they were like they're podcasting in America, which is like, I mean, they admitted there's like 1,000,005 reform podcasts, and they were like, we can't keep up with everyone. Like, there's like the Ali Bestucky, like there's tons of people like this. But do you find that we got the short end of the stick in Canada? Like, I feel like they have so much to cover with such radical stuff. Like they're talking about Satanism, and like we just don't see that in Canada. Like it's not publicized in Canada the same as in the States.
Yeah,
So we cover it from afar sometimes, but like they're like, yeah, they talk about these movements. It's like they're in their backyard all the time, even though he's in Idaho and pumpkin country, whatever.
Yeah, I think there's plenty that goes on in Canada. I think we just default, we just assume that we're boring and there's nothing going on, and our just eyes just like we can't help it. We just look to the south and we're like, oh, what's happening here? It just sucks all of our attention. So I don't know. There's definitely, but yeah, there's for sure not as many reform podcasts. Like we couldn't think of one, and that's why we started this, at least for our like kind of niche area. So yeah, whatever. Any other thoughts on them, John, before we flip to your movie reviews that are coming up?
Yeah, no, I just say you can only help the people you know, right? And then other people might benefit as well, but you gotta focus in on someone. So we're all trying to help a particular demographic here in Canada that we are well acquainted with, and it's amazing. I don't know what the numbers are for outside of Canada for you guys, but our RP goes to just Canada, but the website is 3/4 somewhere else. So
yeah, that's crazy. Yeah. Well, I think we do like 10 to 15% of our audience is from outside of the country, but like probably 10% of that's American, and then a couple Aussies, and which actually we do get some good feedback from Aussies. So shout out to all of y'all down under. That's appreciated. Some dedicated and faithful listeners down there. Okay, finally, to wrap up this roundup episode, John's got a couple of his favorite movies from 2023 so far, which includes Sound of Freedom. At least it's on the list. We're going to discuss it. I don't know if John loved it or not, but he'll give us his thoughts. So hot take coming up.
Yeah. You guys said best of 2023. So that wasn't a couple. That's like a half dozen this year. There are just all sorts of fun movies coming out, starting with, of course, Super Mario Brothers. because like, how can you not lead with that?
Chris Pratt, come on.
Yeah. But has anybody escaped playing that game? So it was fun to go to that with my kids, but they actually didn't even know we don't have a Nintendo in the house, so I had to like play them videos of other people playing Nintendo to get them acquainted with like what this was.
That's what kids do these days. They watch videos of people opening toys up and stuff.
Yeah, do you guys know Studio C? Have you run across them?
Yeah, I've heard of them before. Yep.
Kid comedy, so they had some Super Mario Brothers skits. But yeah, that was a fun and relatively innocent movie with a lot of comic violence. So you might not want to have your very youngest kids with you, but the good guys win. The skeletal weird creatures lose. So longer review available at Reform Perspective. But more in keeping with maybe what was expected, there have been some pretty impressive and helpful films. The sequel to Is Genesis History, that came out a couple years ago, a documentary called Mountains After the Flood. And this is just a bunch of creation scientists looking at the Grand Canyon and other exposed strata around the world, investigating why there are giant folds through the strata. And this strata is supposed to have formed over hundreds of thousands of years. So if it bent after it was formed, why isn't it cracked? And so they're effectively looking at this and saying, this is really compelling evidence for the flood, laid down in the flood, bent in the cataclysmic occurrences going on at the time, and bent while it was still soft at that time. So it's a bit of a technical movie, more so than Is Genesis History, but it's for someone who's got interest in that area, it'll feed them. And it's just important. They're trying to also show the rigor of creation scientists. These guys are doing real science. So not a movie for kids, but a movie a lot of adults could appreciate. I went and saw, I'm running through this, but I went and saw The Hiding Place, a 2023 version of Corrie ten Boom's story. And it's a filmed stage play, which sounds really boring, but it was incredibly compelling. Oscar-winning performances. It'll knock your socks off. I went with my 11-year-old. There are a few scenes where I basically covered her eyes because it's a stage play. I thought it wouldn't be nearly, there wasn't going to be anything too gory in a stage play, but there were a few really emotional scenes that just one guy effectively being tortured, but he's not, but he quivers. So the passion on his face, it's just too much. Okay. But I mentioned that I brought my 11-year-old because she was blown away. She doesn't know anything about this period of time. To see it up close and personal, it's still in theaters. It's here and there across Canada. I was wondering if they might have taken God's name in vain a couple times. Because I was watching in a theater, I couldn't really rewind it. But it is a film that's all about glorifying God. God is the star of this. There's a 1973 Hiding Place movie as well. And in that one, God is also the star, but Corrie is kind of highlighted. In this one, Corrie is actually presented as kind of the grudging accomplice of her dad and her sister, who are just almost unworldly. Like we can't, how could anybody be that holy? And then Corrie is more like us, where it's like she's wondering, why is God doing this to them? And her sister is helping her through it. So incredibly compelling play. And if you can watch it streaming or in theaters, awesome. Sound of Fury. Both you guys haven't seen it yet, but you should. Everybody's talking about it. It's a true story.
Sound of Freedom. Sound of Freedom, right?
You know what? I called it Sound of Fury like 1,000 times. That is not what it's called. Sound of Freedom.
Okay.
True story of Tim Ballard. He is actually a former Homeland Security agent who was fighting pornographers, but basically wanted was challenged, what about the kids themselves? So he kind of went rogue with a little bit of the permission of his boss covering his butt, to go outside of the US and do an undercover operation to free these guys. Absolutely insane man. If like, you can't imagine what his wife, like, the risks this guy took. At one point he's like taking on an entire army by himself. And yeah, I can't believe that it's true, but he's Mormon. He's being played by a Roman Catholic. The explicitly faith element of this is fairly low for both of those reasons. This is meant for a broadly conservative audience. Where it gets a little bit odd in my mind is, after you see this, you learn about sex trafficking of kids and all this, you're left wondering, well, what can I do? And the film kind of says, well, you could get more people to watch the film, which isn't the most, I don't know, the most helpful. So I went and talked to Theo Lauder, who has worked with Servants Anonymous, a group in BC and other places, but safoundation.com, that works to get people out of the sex trade. So just, if you go to this and you see this, and you want to do something, those are the sorts of things that you might be able to put some hands on. The only other thing I'd add to that is, a lot of people left this absolutely freaked out that somebody's going to be stealing their kid, instantly. Most of this is done through people who know people. Like, they're going to sidle up to kids that they know. So if you don't have to worry about random drive-by sees, grab your kid and go. A lot of parents were really freaked out by this movie, and I understand why, but it's not quite that. And do we got time for one more?
Sure, one more.
Always.
John MacArthur put out a movie, and John MacArthur is best known for being one of the few pastors to keep his church mostly open, briefly closed during COVID lockdowns. He is also remarkably a pastor who thinks the American Revolution was sinful, sinful rebellion, and that it should never have happened. So among American pastors, I thought it was rather astonishing that, like, the one American pastor who thinks the American Revolution was sinful was also the pastor who said to the government, go away, we're going to do the opposite of what you say. So I wanted to see this film quite badly. Went and checked it out, and essentially it's his apologetic. It was really well done. They kind of sidestep the idea of masks. They mention it sometimes. They mention James Coates. They touch on some other things, but mostly it was just in reference to the lockdown itself. And he makes a compelling case. He's trying to tell us that the hypocrisy of government officials kind of gave them clues as to how serious the pandemic really was. These guys are telling them to do one thing and we're doing another themselves. At one point, they had the BLM stuff going on. If you guys remember this, they're letting the riots happen. So you could go and burn something down without a mask. You can go get in a big group that way. Well, some of the first people to come to MacArthur's church, he's preaching out there in front of it, at the front, and people just started coming, and they didn't lock the doors. So he was basically live streaming, but just more and more each Sunday, more and more people came. Well, among the first people to come were the police, and they weren't coming to shut them down. They're coming because BLM had them utterly crushed. These people were spitting on them, people were throwing stuff at them, people were telling them defund them. And there are just Christian police officers who are they couldn't go anywhere else to hear God's word preached. They went to John MacArthur's church, not to shut it down, but to be fed. So,
Wow. That's cool.
Yeah. So, quite a movie. I hope to have some kind of group night and discuss it. I think he took a little bit of the easy way out to sidestep masks, because that would be a more complicated one. But he's essentially delivering an apologetic for why his church stayed open.
I think that's probably like an important exercise, honestly, because as much as we all want to put all these things behind us, like it's like dealing with these issues, right? And the next time it happens, you don't want to be that guy, but it's good to know what we think about it. And I think a lot of us made it through this whole shenanigan and didn't necessarily come to a this is what I would do next time kind of conclusion. So whether we just thought we were right the whole time or whatever, but I mean, yeah, it's definitely something that's worth going to tackle.
Yeah, and I do think one of the big walkaways that we need to take to prepare us for next time is there's so many things we didn't know, but then governmental hypocrisy is not just outrageous, it's informative. If they think that everyone needs to wear a mask, but they don't, those are the guys who supposedly know more than us. Then we can learn something from that. Then it's not really about how bad the pandemic is. It's about something else, because it clearly isn't enough to impact how they are going to live their lives. So guys who walked up to the podium, put on their mask now, Joe Biden just had this too. He just got tested positive for COVID, and he was joking to the media to not let everybody know that he had walked into the room without his mask. Well, either you need to wear your mask, you don't. And if you're not, then clearly you don't think it's something that should be enforced on you. So I can take something from that. I can learn that. And where I'm going with this, I'm trying to bring this around a little bit quicker. Where I'm going with this is if it had been the common cold and they had told us to lock down, what would we have all have done? Would anybody have locked down?
No.
And if it had been Ebola, would we have locked down?
Ourselves down.
We would all lock down. So a very big part of determining whether we should listen to the government was an evaluation of what the pandemic really was. And so that's where getting information, not just from what they're saying, but God says too that we can judge people by their actions. If their actions don't match their words, it is their actions that tell us who they really are. So that's where I think hypocrisy is something to really be watching for. It's informative.
Totally.
Yeah,
I
just check that one out.
Yeah, I would like to watch. I went on the website the other day, and they it's still in theaters, I think mostly in the States. I don't know if it's in Canada. You can pre-order like DVD, whatever. And apparently it's coming to streaming, but that's like later this fall. So we'll kind of see about that.
Yeah, it was supposed to be out August 31 on streaming, but it's not. And I think that must be because it's doing pretty good.
Yep, makes sense.
That's good. He's in California. So like, does California even let you stream that?
They're restrictive there, but yes, they can still use the internet.
Oh, okay. That's good for now.
Yes, for now.
Right on. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of today's roundup episode. Like, I don't know how long we went, but probably under an hour, so not too shabby, but I think we got into it. We had some good discussions about the last 3 episodes. It was good to chat again with Jon, especially after kind of summer away from not seeing you too much. So thanks for joining us, Jon. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Okay, well, until next time, as always, feel free to reach out if you've got any questions, comments, concerns. All the contact info is in the description below. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Real Talk. Till then. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you want to send us your feedback, and we'd love to hear it, please email us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. If you want to find us online or social media, we got a lot of great content there. Just search Reformed Real Talk and we should come right up. This show is created and produced by myself, Lucas Holtfluer, and Tyler Vanderwood, and our wonderful podcast manager who does all the editing is Mariah Tamiga. So we're really thankful for her contribution to the show as well. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for watching or listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.